Hello again, my friends. Welcome back. Hope you're ready because today we are going to take a look at a very important topic for us as test managers, test monitoring and control. Now, I know test monitoring and control might not sound that exciting. This is true, by the way, but trust me, if you don't master this, you're basically flying blind. And that's not something you want to do when you are someone who's responsible for the quality of the software. So let's carefully walk through it. Let's first understand what test monitoring is really about. Test monitoring is simply about keeping an eye on the actual test progress and then comparing that progress to something like what we originally planned for in the test plan. During test monitoring, you're basically asking yourself this question over and over. Where are we compared to where we should be? Now, what are the things that you as a test manager should monitor? A bunch of stuff actually. So you need to keep track of the test execution status. I mean, how many test cases have been run so far? Maybe how many of them passed and how many failed. You also need to monitor defects. I'm talking about how many defects were reported, okay? What severity levels they have, and if any interesting trends are emerging. For instance, are the most of the defects coming from a particular module? That's something you want to know as early as possible. Coverage is another important aspect. So you need to check whether your tests are properly covering the requirements or the identified risks. Not only that, but covering the most critical requirements and risks first is super important. Resource usage is another big one, as you have to monitor how your team is consuming time and budget. If you're burning through your resources twice as fast as planned, that's a big red flag. Also, deviations from the test plan need to be spotted. And I guess you want to see what's not going according to the test plan before it becomes a full-blown problem. And of course, you also need to keep track of risks, not just the old ones, but also any new risks that might pop up as the project progresses. Also, if the project's or the product's requirements change for any reasons, which happens a lot, by the way, in real life, your monitoring needs to capture that too. Let me give you a small example. Suppose you have planned to execute 500 test cases this week. It's already Wednesday, and when you check, you found that only 120 test cases have been executed so far. Now, without proper monitoring, you might only realize this problem on Friday, too late as a matter of fact. But with good monitoring in place, you can catch this gap very early and you can immediately start investigating why things are moving more slowly and how you can fix it. Pretty powerful, I must say. Now, once you collect all these monitoring metrics, it's not enough to just look at them and nod your head. You must take action. And this brings us to the next important activity, test control. Test control is where you, Mr. Manager, step in and make decisions based on what you found during monitoring. The goal is to put things on track and back to what's planned. So let's talk about the kinds of actions you might need to take as a part of your control process. Maybe you'll have to restructure your team. For example, if testing new features manually is moving slower than expected, you might assign an automation tester to help the manual team. And believe me, he's going to get all the fun in the world. We can also think of adjusting schedules. Maybe you want to delay a milestone by a few days to make sure quality isn't compromised. You can also reevaluate your test budget and maybe increase or even decrease it according to the project's needs. Now, when too many unexpected risks or major deviations are encountered, sometimes small modifications are not enough. You may need to replan entirely, and I know that sounds horrifying, but it happens. And if things get really out of hand, you might have to temporarily stop testing altogether. For instance, if the build quality is so poor that testing can't even proceed, it's better to hold and ask the development team to stabilize things first, and then you can give testing the green light again. You might also need to request new environments, tools, or even reconsider your approach if you find that your original assumptions were wrong. The thing is, as a test manager, you should be comfortable making all these kinds of calls. I know some of these decisions might sound hard to do, but remember, monitoring finds the problems and control is how to solve them. And to make it clear as possible, you must solve them because at the end of the day, it's your responsibility. All right, folks. One, or let's say two last things about test monitoring and control I want to discuss with you before we wrap up this lecture. That's monitoring framework and the control loop. Let's start with the monitoring framework. And as the name implies, it's just a framework. So just a bunch of tools, best practices, and approaches that will help us to see the big picture. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all framework for every project, manager, or organization. But in most cases, any monitoring framework is mainly composed of the following elements: the goals, and these are the targets we want to achieve during a predefined period, like achieving a particular coverage percentage or executing a number of test cases. Then come the metrics, and those are just some quantifiable values that reflects the testing progress or the suit quality so far. So maybe you have just executed 150 test cases out of the 200 planned. You also have to find yourself a way to collect these metrics and another way to report them. Then comes the most important cornerstone of your monitoring framework, the control points. These control points are sometimes called decision triggers, and they're just predefined rules that tell you when to take an action. For instance, you can say that if more than 10% of test cases fail, we should hold a code review session. Of course, test management tools are your best friend here, and I can't think of a better example than Jira. Very well, let's now take a quick look at the control loop. A control loop is a well-known cycle called the PDCA cycle. That stands for plan, do, check, and act. So first, you plan. This is where you define what are you going to do and how you will measure it. Then you do. You execute tests and record the results. After that, you check. You compare your actual results to the plan you have made. And finally, you act. This is done by making adjustments based on what you found. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's just because this is very much in sync with agile practices and continuous improvement cycles. You're continuously checking and adjusting, not just setting a plan at the beginning and blindly following it until the end. Of course, when you are a test manager, you don't work alone, and you need to communicate the test monitoring and control results to your teammates and other stakeholders. Who? Well, anyone who might be interested. However, not all stakeholders have the same point of interest in your monitoring and control activity. For instance, the business manager might want to know the current product safety stance. The project manager, on the other hand, might be interested in something else, like how fast the budget is being consumed. And the development team might just want to look at the trends just to know where the bugs are clustering. Because of this difference in interests, you should also provide different ways when reporting. So you can use graphs, burn down charts, project dashboards, or any other illustrative method at your disposal. However, try not to go very technical with the project and business managers. Keep the technicality for the tech folks like the development and testing teams. All right, my friends. Test monitoring and control? Check. The next stop would be test completion. So I'll see you there. Take care.